This episode is sponsored by Law Tigers New Mexico. Law Tigers New Mexico have been fighting insurance companies on your behalf since 2001. With Law Tigers, you never ride alone.
This is a Rust is Gold Racing Podcast, episode 65, on Monday, January 24th. We are here at the Rust is Gold coffee shop. I am Phoenix, and I am here with Hollywood Garcia.
Down the way, not too far, an old-time Rockabilly coffee bar. Record machine tucked in the back, Elvis singing about a Cadillac. I'm on a BSA, been riding all day. Leather's on, goggles too, triumphant, I don't know what you wanna do. My boys are on Ducatis, happy now all the while. Yeah, these new rockers, it's their style. So let's ride, so let's ride.
We have a really cool show coming up today, and a really special guest, somebody that has become a really good friend to the shop and to Thaison and myself personally.
So yeah, we have Tom Antreasian in the house, one of my favorite motorcycle builders, collectors that I've met over the years. Wealth of knowledge. You had the opportunity to go down to his shop also.
Yeah.
And it's, you know, he's got like a walk-in museum. It's very cool.
Yeah, he's one of those guys that just completely knows the value of a particular bike, and not just monetarily. He knows a bike and what he can do with it, and to have a vision like that, it's amazing. I'm so excited to hear what he has to say about his history with motorcycles.
Yeah, and for our listeners, those of you that know Tom, yeah, I mean, you know his backstory, you know his wealth of knowledge, and we're honored to have him here as a guest. So
cool.
Want to get into it?
Let's do it. As soon as I met him, I knew that he was going to be one of those people that I was going to enjoy talking to and hanging out with and learning from. And I think, Thaison, you met him first, didn't you? Yeah,
at the first shop. And Tom had actually come in once or twice. And then, long story short, he'd come in one day, and as everybody knows, I was having a lot of difficulties at that shop. Almost daily, I would, have various people tell me that I need to give up on the motorcycle coffee shop aspect and that, I should switch to this business or that business and everything else in between.
Acting, right? People were like, Hollywood, you should take up acting.
Totally. Give up coffee. It's not going to get you anywhere. No, but more so along the lines of like, oh, motorcycles aren't going anywhere. You need to adopt this model of a coffee shop. And after like a year of hearing that, it just kind of starts to get in your head a little too often. So one day, Tom had come in, and it was one of those things where I was just down on the idea of whether or not motorcycle coffee shop was going to actually work in Albuquerque. And the idea was that Tom came in and he was like, we're going to go basically on this field trip, and I'm going to show you my shop and then a couple of my buddies, the Antique Motorcycle Club guys. Take the day off, come look at some of these bikes. And went to Tom's house, looked through his collection, went, and he took me to 2 or 3 other guys' collections in Albuquerque, and that was exactly what I needed at that exact moment, because I was feeling really down on the idea of this shop and everything. And seeing other guys that believe in the motorcycle industry and the bikes the way we do, right, really kind of helped me get through that nasty point that I was going through.
Kind of pulled you out of the rut.
Yeah, so I mean, long story short, like that kind of recharged my battery in a way that I needed to have it done. Secondly, when I was able to see Tom's vision, as you did, Steve, later on, and looking through his collection and the way he curates his bikes, you start to see a builder and a collector that sees motorcycles almost as an art form. Right. You're walking into a museum, and that's also what I needed to see. So I don't know if you noticed this, Tom, but like that really, again, I get sentimental almost, when I see something and somebody appreciates something as much as we do. Yeah. It reaffirms our belief in what we're doing. Yeah. So I know it's a long story. Yeah. But I just wanted to thank you for that, because I needed that at that exact moment.
Well, welcome to the podcast, Tom.
Thank you.
We're excited to have you. We've been trying to do this, I think, for a while, and we finally had all the planets align at the right time, and here you are. So welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Great to be here. Thanks for the compliments.
Yeah, I mean, I think Steve would have just as many awesome things to say too.
So many. I mean, Tom and I share a couple of passions, motorcycles and design. You're a graphic designer by trade. And we spent some hours and lunches talking about our love of graphic design and how design influences motorcycles and vice versa. And it was like a kindred spirit talking to you, because I could feel the passion for design and motorcycling and life and art, and it just kind of like, just felt like a kindred spirit.
Both of you talk to so many people. I'm surprised you felt that way, because I've got to believe you feel that, you get that feedback from other folks too. It's hard to know how you personally come off as a collector or a builder to people that do the same thing, because a lot of folks specialize so much. But I have a pretty wide range of interests within bikes, as you both know. And I guess it surprised me and pleased me, but we liked you guys from the start. We loved your idea, and anything we can do to help your endeavor here, we're going to keep going with you.
Well, I appreciate that.
Sure.
You know, it means a lot.
Great fun. But I'm not going to give you a board track.
Oh, shucks.
I know. So close.
Oh, dang.
Yeah, it's interesting that, you said you're surprised we haven't talked to other people like that. And there's a certain number, I think, of things that click together when you meet people, right? You meet people that have great collections, but maybe their personalities don't jive very well with you, or they don't appreciate it for the same reason somebody else does. I think one of the things that Thaison and I both like about you and your lovely partner Maureen is that you guys come from an art background, and the appreciation for these things as art is something that appeals to our sensibilities. But you also love motorcycles for what they are, and you like coffee. So those three things kind of line up.
That's pretty good.
That hits us right at home.
Now that Steve and I have talked a lot about this, we're doing all the explaining for Tom here.
I know, right?
When did you first find that passion for motorcycles?
My family came from the Midwest, from Indiana. We moved out to Albuquerque here in 1965, 64. I had no knowledge of motorcycles. A Midwest kid, starting junior high out here in Albuquerque, but wide open spaces, I started noticing these things that kids were putting around on, and they weren't mopeds, they were small motorcycles. That's right about the time that Honda motorcycles started the You Meet the Nicest People on a Honda campaign, came out with the tiny little step-through bikes that appealed to these wide ranges of folks. I noticed that, even though I didn't really know what they were, boy, they sure looked like fun. Of course they were. Even though I walked to school, I badgered my dad endlessly until he agreed, took me over to Bobby J's Yamaha, which back then was over by the fairgrounds, bought my first motorcycle, a little Yamaha 55cc, and I was on my way. But I must say, it was as much fun riding, learning how to ride, and exploring this wide open desert town back then as it was learning about the bikes themselves, because I love being outdoors. I love hiking, and both of us do, Maureen and I. So the bike was a great way to get way beyond foot range and bicycle range, and there was something cool about it, even back then. So that got me started riding, but it wasn't until a few years later that Bobby J, who liked me because I guess I had manners, offered me a job as a beginning mechanic and a setup guy that would uncrate new bikes. That got me interested in the mechanics of motorcycles and learning how they worked, and that was a whole new ball game and a lot of fun.
And how old were you at that point?
I was just entering high school then, so
14, 15?
That's right.
Yeah.
And of course, in high school, I was also just about to get my driver's license, get my first car, also loved hot rods, also loved anything mechanical. But hot rodding and motorcycling is what kids did back then.
So right at that time, I mean, Bobby J has a legacy here in New Mexico. So you were right there at the time when they were kind of at their pinnacle, right? I mean, there was all this racing and motorcycle going on here.
Handful of flat tracks around. Road racing was still fairly new, at least in the Southwest, and you mostly had to drive quite a ways to find a good road race course. There was a lot of club activity within the Harley people here back then in the 60s and so forth, but not nearly as organized as it is now, in my opinion. But the emphasis was you were either Harley guy or you were one of these Jap guys who rode a Honda or Yamaha or whatever it happened to be. And Bobby J was of that new group of dealers who saw the future. He started as an Indian dealer, had a shop up on Central in the 50s, and then he brought Yamaha, and Al Simonson, who was another competitive old dealer here, used to be an Indian dealer, bought Honda, and then another dealer bought Suzuki, and that began the Japanese, I guess I'd call it the conversion of Albuquerque. The British guys were always around. There were a couple of dealers, and there were always a couple of Harley dealers around. But by that time, Indian was pretty much gone, and it was either you were a hardcore big biker or Harley guy, or you were interested in this new kind of activity, which is fun small bikes. And I happened to be right there in that time, and Bobby J and his family were great folks to me. By the way, I designed that logo for them. I don't know if you ever saw it, but at the time, we won't go into that other than it was fun. I was thrilled to death that he'd take it for free. And if I had a penny now for every use he made of it, you know how that story goes.
Oh, yes, I do.
So you're uncrating motorcycles and you're kind of piecing them together, wheels, I'm guessing, suspension, handlebars, things like that. Were you the youngest person in that shop at that time doing that?
Not at all.
Or was there a team of guys?
Bobby's son, Stanley, was a little younger than me, and that was one son. And anyway, and Bobby's daughter, Sandy, was also made to be an enthusiast because she was part of that family. All of them rode. And there were young kids that were friends of Stan's who also eventually got jobs in the shop. Jobs really meant, if you were a beginner, washing bikes, or if you got good, changing a tire, or maybe throwing out the trash, brushing up the floor, that kind of thing. But mostly they were my age or older guys who were established mechanics who got traditional mechanical jobs outside of the automotive field. Same kind of people that worked on bulldozers here, or tractors, or other kinds of internal combustion stuff. We were all separate from the next layer up, which was aviation people, aviation mechanics, but there was this connection that I find wonderful, that a lot of Bobby's customers were mechanics. A lot of them worked for the railroad. They were mechanics on steam locomotives or diesels. And there's something fun when you have this common ground with people who are mechanically minded, but you're all putting around on two wheels, and you just have this big grin on your face. And we were all discovering Albuquerque in a lot of new ways. That was before trials riding was really big too. That came along, in the later 60s and the 70s in Albuquerque area at least, and different aspects of the sport grew. Speedway Park is an example, a dirt oval that used to be south of Central on Eubank. It was mostly jalopy racing, circle track racing, but they slowly incorporated motorcycle racing too. Bobby J was still a rider back then, and maybe a dozen other guys were riding bikes. Back then, big British stuff, Harleys, KRs, and so forth.
It really, like, hearing you talk about it, like, you don't think about that, but there was the dirt track south of Central. There was a couple of flat tracks. It was the Santa Fe track, right?
There was also, in Albuquerque, the Unsers had land on the west side and back of Bobby's land on the south of 9 Mile Hill. They had a little TT course. North side of Albuquerque, there used to be a small private airport. I think it was Coronado. And nearby that was another locally owned TT dirt track that also had flat tracks. And there were a couple others. Some of those didn't last long, but the ones I just mentioned were around quite a long time.
Could you imagine that now, Thaison?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about it, and like visually, I'm imagining all these like Model Ts and Model A hot rods going, in the circle track, and then a bunch of old like Indians and BSAs and Triumph show up and they do the flat track. I mean, it just seems like the coolest thing in the world.
Cool.
But at the same time, I think also is like the pinnacle of like Tom was mentioning, hot rodding and mechanicking. being a mechanic, sorry, and then motorcycling right here in Albuquerque.
Yeah.
Like it's all going on, and it's probably almost every weekend. There's a race or there's some sort of event taking place.
Grants had a well-known track, a dirt track for a long time, Uranium Capital Speedway. Clovis had a dirt track, and then all over the state there were scrambles courses and enduro courses that were temporary put-ups that a dealer would do to bring business. Roswell, Carlsbad, Alamogordo, all those places had tracks. And that was transitioning after World War II, where right after the war, before all the Japanese small stuff came, guys were riding big stripped down bobbers, Harleys, Indians, and so forth. And the very first British bikes were coming into the States then. That's the kind of stuff that was riding on those outside area courses. Then these flat tracks started getting developed, and the big bikes were still there, but they were fading. And as this new stuff came along, a whole new wave of people came along.
Wow, that's so cool. I mean, trying to imagine it from Tom's perspective, of seeing the generations of these motorcycles, mechanics, hot rodding, and like this, the trends of how it's come and go. Like,
well, we've got the YouTube episode that just came out where we're talking about racing in this episode. And Bill Horn and I are out at the flat track at Sandia, and we're talking about, it's cool that we got a flat track here. But Tom's talking about like 6 or 7 flat tracks that were around at that time.
Generations of motorcycles.
Exactly. That's
just... It's amazing.
Yeah, I wish we could go back to that time.
Well, obviously, times change, but the other funny thing that I'm surprised you guys haven't mentioned it, even in the time you've been involved in this, if you talk to a generation earlier than me, or even farther back, those guys had a whole nother set of peers and friends. If you go down Central now to Atrisco and turn right north on Atrisco, about 5 blocks north, there's an old stone building on the east side of the street. If you're unaware of it, it's the original Albuquerque Motorcycle Clubhouse, and it says that set in the rock in the top of the...
No kidding.
Go
that
look
sounds like
at
a pilgrimage, Thaison.
Sounds like a field
You
trip.
need to go.
Yeah.
And wherever else all of that went, that was way earlier than any of us even knew about. Of course, the Harley guys had the lineage and the friends that they could tell you about all that, but not unless you were part of their group.
Sure.
And one of those people in their club. But one last story about this, and I'll keep it very brief. The Honda dealer I mentioned earlier, Al Simonson, was one of Albuquerque's earliest Indian dealerships down on 2nd Street. And I have a picture of him, a black and white photograph. He's wearing what looked like cowboy chaps, almost jodhpurs, and these clothes that were like out of the 20s that you see in old board track photographs. And he was just back from a club run where they rode 20 or 30 people up to Maes for a picnic for the day. And I have no idea what route they took, but likely it was mostly dirt.
Can you
all the way
imagine?
up there.
Oh my gosh.
Quite an adventure, and those guys were living it up, and in their mind, I'm sure, couldn't get any better than that. I just went through another narrow segment of time we just talked about, and you guys are living in another time now, in my opinion.
No, but this is what I love about this conversation with Tom, is he's a walking encyclopedia of knowledge. No, you are, Tom. Like you're very smart, and you got a sharp mind, and he's a historian through motorcycling, and especially through New Mexico motorcycles and Albuquerque. And I don't think this is a lost piece of history, that it's important to hear these stories, for generations to come. And these stories need to be out there, and they need to be told. And I would love to see somebody write a book about like Albuquerque motorcycling history.
Like somebody like Tom?
Somebody like Tom. But like, this is it. If we don't have the book, then we have Tom, and we have others like him. And this is so important for our listeners, and I think the future generations to hear these stories,
I'm going to qualify you because you're a history teacher, right?
I am, but
well,
I'm a part coffee shop owner and a race team guy now, so my history is falling apart.
The point I want to make is this is, remember, folks, just my personal opinion. Yes, I lived through the times I mentioned, but if some other old geezer hears this and calls in and he said, that guy's full of blah, 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 it didn't happen that way at all, I get it. It's another interpretation. I felt exactly the way you both do, that somebody would really do well to write a book or some record about all of this. And to tell you the truth, now that burning desire is softening with me, because I think if you care about it as an individual, you'll chase down guys like me and say, hey, I want to know more about this. Where can I find out? And I will point you to books or magazines or friends I know, the few who are still alive, or the families, particularly of people who are gone, who really lived it, and they'll say, I don't know you, but come over and I'll share a family scrapbook with you. And oh my goodness, you don't know what you're in for then, because it's wonderful if you care about all of that.
I think we've kind of got to, I think we kind of have a responsibility, though, to sort of share that information, because there's so many kids out there now that are living in, kind of a solitary existence, especially with the pandemic. They're not getting out there. And we say this all the time. When we grew up, we were outside all the time. We were riding bikes, we were riding motorcycles. There was an opportunity to connect with people like you, and how some kids will be with Thaison and I soon, probably. These are the old guys that own the coffee shop and ride motorcycles. There was an opportunity to do that before. There was an opportunity to connect. I think it's getting narrower and narrower now, so we have to do things like this. This is why Thaison and I do the coffee shop, and we do the race team, and we try and bring kids in and do demos and stuff, because they're not going to find it on their own anymore, I don't think, and that's unfortunate, but it's the times that we live in. So I think we have to take that opportunity to do it now. And I hope more people like you and us and other people listening will do that, because that's the only way it's going to get shared.
I appreciate that. I think, again, I find you guys a little bit unique in that way, but in a way, you putting these things together and putting these stories out there, I hope motivates people to say, hey, I want to know more. So I want them to chase me down on the street, or ask somebody, or come to see you guys and say, give me that guy's phone number or something. By the way, that's not listed. But I hear what you're saying, but I still think it took me chasing down people, even back in the day, to learn what I learned. I'm glad I did that now.
Yeah.
And I'm still chasing things like libraries and so forth to learn. But I felt like I didn't have anybody who was doing what I was doing.
Sure.
Each of us has our own interpretation of this and why it's important. A lot of the wonderful folks you guys interview I can feel the fire. You can hear it coming out of their voices. And some of them are friends of mine, and I watch them and I believe them. They're very honest in that way. There's a lot of reclusive people, though, and I guess I'd be partly in that group, who you'll have to come to me, because I'm not looking for ways to tell my story anymore. I had a college friend who wanted to put out the book you've just described, and he and I began on it 20, 25 years ago, and I still have a folder of notes, but there's too much to do, life gets in the way, blah, blah, blah. And by the way, I've got another bike I want to work on. So.
Sure. No, trust me, we know. And yeah. It's difficult, but again, like I mentioned before, part of I think Steve and I's vision and passion is we needed a place like this, because Bobby J's and Indian and Harley and all these local shops that were there for you as a kid might not be as accessible for some of these kids now. So that's what the coffee shop and the motivation for this really is, and that's what's kept us kind of going. But we still know that there's so much more that needs to be done. And part of that is sitting down with people like you, Tom, and all these other guys. We're going to keep seeking them out as much as we can.
Good.
Through your help and assistance.
Good.
Yeah.
But again, like you're an anomaly in a way that you have that photographic memory, and then you have the vision for it. So I want to kind of get back to something else, because you also worked in a museum for a while.
Yes.
So I think that's also very fascinating. How did that come about? And
Well, it's going to sound like two different worlds, but I come from a family of artists. My dad was a lifetime teacher and a painter and a printmaker. So I grew up going to museums, whether I liked it or not, and learning about the art world. And I was an art major for a time when I started UNM. I never graduated from college, but I decided I wanted to become a commercial artist as an offshoot because I knew I'd never follow through as a fine artist. So I went to graphics and art school in California at a place called Art Center. And at the time, that school specialized in automotive design and industrial design. If you went there and graduated, you could get a job in Detroit. Well, for various reasons, I wasn't able to go that way, but I stayed with sort of the fine art side of things. Dropped out of that college before I graduated, and dropped out of all of the education, moved to Taos, where my motorcycle friends were, and kind of went backwards, but never left art totally behind. Naturally, Taos, Santa Fe are art centers themselves, so that stuff was always around me, and I was very aware of it through my parents and all of my background. I couldn't leave it behind. It's just funny how that combined with the motorcycle thing led to who I've become. Because maybe different from you guys, I tried hard to separate those things all the time. I never shared my motorcycle activities with my folks, and frankly, they weren't interested. They didn't understand. They were wonderful enough to let me be involved in it, but no interest. At the same time, they kept trying to cultivate me more and more towards the fine art world, and eventually I became a graphic designer, and then I started morphing into artistic jobs or more creative jobs, and because of my connections through family in the art world, I knew a lot of the museum people. Eventually a job opening came up at the Albuquerque Museum for a graphic designer. I interviewed for it, and I got it. And I worked as a graphics guy there for a few years, and then my boss, who was the curator of exhibits, retired. So it was time for me to step up or move on. So I stepped up and I became what they call a curator of exhibits. Curator is another whole discussion for another time, but in general, I was a supervisor of a department where I would take a exhibition and look at it like a movie script and art direct an installation of what that exhibit had to be. I worked with a disciplinary curator who'd happened to be an art or history curator and helped tailor the look of that exhibition. Now, all the time I'm doing this, I'm separating these things. I go home at night and there are my babies in my garage and my wonderful projects, and I go inside and read motorcycle magazines or whatever, watch a movie. But the next day, I'd shut all that out of my mind and go back to work and focus hard on fine art or history.
But let me stop you for a second. Sorry to interrupt. But you're chasing the art because Taos is filled with artists, and galleries, and the same thing in Santa Fe and a little bit more in Albuquerque. But even in these different locations, you're still tied into the motorcycle world. You're still working at dealerships, correct, and getting parts and all that other kind of stuff. Yeah.
Well, for example, when I lived in Taos, which was for a short time, I worked as a mechanic for my old boss from Albuquerque who had started a shop up there. Anyway, there were, as you could guess, handful of artists who all had bikes, and they needed tune-ups and whatever else, and the more successful they were, the more work we did for them, including washing and waxing and delivering their bikes, teaching their kids how to ride, or deep motor work if they blow something up over the weekend or run it off a cliff. So I was still involved mostly with bikes in Taos and Santa Fe, but the art world again was sort of encroaching.
Sure.
And every now and then one of those famous guys would come in the door, and I'd say to my boss, "You know who that is?" And he'd say, "No." And I'd say, "That's blah, 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 that's so-and-so." And he'd say, "I don't know who that is." Well, they were some big name artist. didn't matter to him, and those people mostly were separate.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how my life went for a long time, even though both elements were there. There was an interval where growing up, high school, worked in bike shops then. Right after I graduated high school, I got the big pressure that I'm going to college, whether I want to or not. Started UNM, lasted 3 years at UNM, hated it, and said, I can't keep doing this. So that's when I went back to work just temporarily. And then I got even more pressure, and he said, let's put you in school in California. So again, I left the bikes for a while, going to college in Los Angeles. Then I quit there after 2 years, moved to Taos.
Let's talk about California a little bit.
Sure.
When you were at the Art Center in California, did you have a bike out there? Did you do any riding? Were you involved in motorcycles at all?
It was so tantalizing, but the school I went to was so disciplinary, and they loaded you with work. You drew until your hand hurt, or whatever it happened to be. There really wasn't time. And quite honestly, I wasn't that dedicated even to college then. And my God, California was the promised land. That stuff was everywhere.
Right.
All the time. So I will be honest and say many times I ditched class. I would go to a race, or I'd go to a custom bike show, or there'd be a lowrider event. All of the automotive culture,
Yeah.
I was lost. And school was a terrible pull. I had to try to accomplish something in school, but all of this wonderful culture was all around.
That's great. I was hoping you weren't going to say, no, I didn't do any motorcycles or hot rods or anything while I was out there.
Well, I did not have a bike. I had a neat little car, an Alfa Romeo GTV, but I also had an El Camino with a Chevy in it, and I blew that up and so forth. But I didn't race. All I did was look and listen and talk to people. And I had beginning photography classes in school. So instead of going to photograph architecture and buildings, I went to the drags. Or I went to somewhere down to the beach and I'd photograph whatever. But I was mixing those two things back then. So I hope that answers your question a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, most people in Albuquerque now know you as kind of a motorcycle aficionado, collector, and they know you like the old stuff, you know, and you like to work on them and restore them. At what point did you decide that's something that I want to get into? Like, what was the bug that hit you to get like an old bike?
That's harder to describe, but I think I've got a pretty good answer. You'll both understand. Once I was a mechanic, I loved riding the biggest variety. I wanted to ride everything. I wanted to be able to drive a 10-wheeler, and I wanted to be able to operate a bulldozer, but likewise, I wanted to ride every brand and model of every motorcycle. And the more I got to work on, because the shops I worked at were generally multi-repair make shops. So I worked on Harleys, and I worked on Yamahas, and I worked on Triumphs. As a result, I started thinking fondly, God, I really liked that, whatever it was. For a short time, I worked in Albuquerque, I'm backing up again, for the Kawasaki dealer, used to be on the Knoll. He took in a panhead chopper one day, of all the weird things on a trade, for a Mach 3 Kawasaki. You talk about a contrast, but that Harley just mesmerized me. I had to ride that thing. And the dealer just hated it. He didn't want anything to do with it, but he let me take it for a spin. And I thought, someday I'm going to have one of those. I was not a Harley guy, but boy, I was then. And the same thing happened. I rode a Triumph and another Triumph and another one and a couple of BSAs and so forth. And then it just fueled me to ride more and more. At the same time, back then, nothing lasted the same way. It all needed maintenance more often. It all needed parts. So things were broken. Guys wouldn't keep things as long back then, or they'd languish in a garage or a junkyard. I got a chance where a customer would come in and say, take this piece of junk and give me anything, give me $10, and he would leave happily, and I'd wind up with something that I thought, wow, that's cool, and it would sit in my garage. But the point was, I can't wait to fix it and ride it, whether I ever did or not. Probably like both of you, I acquired a lot of things over time that never went anywhere. Fond intentions, but the point was I still was fired to ride everything I could.
Well, as you know, Tom has a pretty eclectic collection of motorcycles. I mean,
Yeah.
it's everything from British to American to,
Weird
tracker,
Japanese stuff.
Japanese racing. I mean, a little bit of everything. What are some of your favorite bikes in your collection and why? I know it's a hard thing to pin down, but you got some real rare kind of gems that I had to look
Thanks.
up and do some research on myself.
You'll like this answer because it relates partly to an earlier question. Some of my favorites have to do with interests of mine before I had the bike. As I said, I liked off-road because I like hiking and camping and so forth. So dirt bikes became fun. And when I was starting dirt bikes, they were Yamaha two-strokes, but what I really wanted was a Triumph dirt bike. And back then, Steve McQueen movies, Bud Ickens movies, guys rode dirt Triumphs, and they were so cool. Desert sleds, they were called. So I wanted a desert sled. The very first bike I collected was a Rickman Matisse Triumph 650, which I still have. Love it. And partly because the influence was a biker movie. In the very beginning 5 minutes, these Harley guys were chasing a Triumph dirt bike in the movie, and I thought, that's so cool. But in the end, what it really became was the bike was wonderful by itself because it was so different from the little light two-strokes I was riding. And again, the variety is the spice of life for me. But towards that variety, my boss and my lifetime dear friend was a road racer. He rode, because Bobby J sponsored him, he was pretty good. He rode a Yamaha 350 GP road bike racer. And I was his mechanic for a couple of summers, and we went all over the country to road race courses while he chased the Southwest Championship. And I was less interested in his bike, although I learned to work on him, than I was in what everybody else had at those races. And man, it opened my eyes, especially the smaller races that had dirt bikes and pavement racing and trials all in the same venue.
Sure. Like a barber kind of track or an event.
Or Sandia back when they were still working,
Sure. Yeah.
So it gave me, again, a chance to ride different things and appreciate different things. And I would get hot on something for a couple of months, and then I'd want to go the other way. So it made me chase these different things. To end this topic you mentioned, I got interested in the variety of bikes around the world, and I got tired of just the variety of Japanese or just the variety of American bikes. So I got interested in European brands, Spanish, Bultaco, Montesa, Czechoslovakian, Jawa, and I could just go right down 6 or 7 countries. I started appreciating all of those. At the same time, especially while I was in Taos, people up there who'd come in as vacationers would bring bikes from all over the Southwest, all brands. I'd have to work on a Jawa one day. I'd have to work on a Harley Sprint Racer another day. I'd have to work on something very different. So all of those things kept building. Gee, I want one of those, or that's kind of cool, or this is so much fun the way this works. And you can see how much trouble it got me into 50 years later.
Well, one of the things that I think is really cool is you don't just collect these things and then have somebody fix it for you. You like to get your hands dirty and get in there. You made a paint booth so you could paint them back to the original colors. You've taught me how to lace wheels because you wanted to know how to do that at some point, so you did it. And I think that's super cool and really interesting that you do it yourself.
Thank you. I will say that has something to do with New Mexico. If you're in California, it's much easier to find a specialist who can weld beautifully, and he's right down the street, or he's available, or he can do it quickly. Here, at least for many years, that was hard to find. And automotive painters and body shop guys and the motorcycle trades, which included wheel lacing or lining brakes or whatever, you couldn't find those guys, or they were specialists, or they didn't want to talk to you, or they were too busy, or blah, blah, blah. So all of us learned to be problem solvers. And I've met more mechanics in every trade who are problem solvers than anything else. They can build a house, they can fix a toilet, they can do anything because of that need to solve a problem.
Sure.
Even though now there are specialists everywhere. And that's why it's ironic what you were talking about earlier. Now, you have to go to a specialist to change the oil on your bike. And that seems so absurd to me.
Kind of. I mean, we're still doing everything on our own because we can't afford to.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
And it almost, I hate to say this, it starts to become almost kind of a sickness in a weird way. Not in a bad way.
It's definitely a sickness.
It's definitely kind of like a bug that bites you, in that everything you start doing on your own, whether or not you can actually do it or fix it. You know, I can't remember the last time I went to anybody, maybe Jake for a little bit of welding help here and there, but like, there's times when Mel's just like, can't you just hire somebody to fix this dishwasher or whatever the case is? Can't you just have somebody else do it? And it's like, you start to get it in your head that like, in a weird way, you have to be the one. No one else can do it. No one else is going to do it exactly the same as you.
Yeah.
You know, and I don't know. I mean, I appreciate it, but at the same time, it's like, if I could afford to have somebody fix the thing here and there, I think I would.
Yeah.
Well, things are expensive now,
They
too.
are.
Sure.
They are.
And I hear this from other people, too. I can't afford to buy a shiny bike, but I wouldn't because I didn't do it.
I'm kind of in that mental mode. I think,
I can see you going that way.
I just, you know, even if I could afford something, I don't know if I would now. You know, I enjoy the idea of bringing something old back to life and just, I don't know, maybe even just to be contrary now.
You
I
would
just
get a
want
new
to.
you would get a new BMW Scrambler. I know you would.
Maybe.
Or a new Royal Enfield. You've talked about it.
Yeah, but I would modify it.
Sure.
So it'd be one of those things where I couldn't just buy a new bike and ride it off the lot. I would take it home and I'd start stripping things off and put things on it and take things off. Maybe. I don't know. I don't know. It's the older I get, the less I want to do that.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
Speaking of which, based on your collection, you've been talking more recently about getting rid of things.
Yeah.
And how did that come about? I mean, you've got all these great bikes. You know, where does the thought come now that I want to get rid of them?
Well, to be really unfair, there's a powerful vibration on my left right now that's very influential. But she's been wonderful and supported me. And if I find a new bike, she's the first to say, are we going to go get it? But I'm starting to feel I have way too much. I can't ride everything. I can't pay proper attention to everything anyway. It seems the natural order to me to start cutting back. Also, as always, my eye is roving, and whether it's a bike or another old pickup truck or something, I've still got other things that I'm interested in, but I have about 30 motorcycles now, and it's too much. A good portion of them are mostly done. The two most valuable and expensive bikes I have are not. And the thought always was, they're the ones I'm saving for the last. I'm not even sure if that's going to happen now, but just to share this, I have one of my bikes is a 28 Indian 101 Scout. It costs so much money just to buy a spark plug for that at a used motorcycle meet. It's just no more fun. It's just, you listen to a seller say, oh sure, here's the part right here you need, $600. And it's who knows what it is, but you can hold it in your hand and it doesn't weigh anything. And you think, I'll make one of those for that price. You can't.
Yeah.
It takes the fun out of this. So unless you can trade sideways to get that stuff, it takes away a lot of the enjoyment that we used to get from finding that part on the ground at a swap meet or in some guy's garage who said, get that out of here.
Yeah. I mean, I'm going through that right now with the Husky, you know, and it's getting harder to find, sometimes you have to find that original part, or the bike isn't going to run with a modern part. It just doesn't transfer over, and it becomes very frustrating.
Or it takes you down a really expensive road.
It takes you down a more expensive road than you ever thought. But I mean, I get the idea of that, especially, and I you know, as a longtime picker and collector myself, I really realized I have too much stuff after I had to move several locations. And you're picking up all these bikes and you're moving them, and you're picking up all these oil cans and all this other stuff, and you're like, geez, I don't know how much more stuff or where I can even put this stuff. Do you know what I mean? And it starts to kind of weigh on you after a while.
Right.
You know, I don't feel bad for somebody that wants to thin their herd. I mean, I totally get it at this point.
I totally get it too. Well, especially if they're going to thin them this way. Just kidding. Tom, but where does like the practicality of it and the curator aspect of it sort of conflict for you? I mean, like, that Indian, you may not want to ride it or buy parts for it, but it's still a showpiece.
Yeah, but how to answer that? It's different for everyone. They're like, I'm assuming your kids are the same way, but for me, part of my appeal to getting that Indian was its great reputation, reading about it and learning about it in books first, and deciding I want that experience to ride that thing. I may hate it when I ride it, but I don't think I'll hate it.
Yeah.
But the other part of it is it's worth as much as a house used to cost in the 1950s now. I have an even earlier bike that's worth all of my other bikes combined. It is something I barely want to touch for that same reason, but the practicality is I love it.
Yeah.
That's not practical, it's just romance. Right. So don't know quite where that goes, other than I'm starting to get tired, and that's just being realistic.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, then I guess the next general or logical question would be, what do you appreciate, or what do you find interesting about motorcycling now? Like the direction of our culture?
Don't take this wrong, but it's you guys. I was telling her tonight driving up here, I have been uninspired by so much of what modern motorcycling is about, except for people like you guys, and sorry for the dirty word, companies like Deus, and companies that are taking the culture and lifestyle and turning it into something that fits now. It's inspiring for me because as an old guy, it helps me look back, but I see kids come in here who don't know much about that particular brand on the shelf, but they like the label, or there's something they relate to that I have no idea about. Let's put a cactus in there, that's cool. We love that. And meeting you guys brought that back to life for me, and I thought, that's why I want to help these guys. I'm keep coming back here and see what they come up with next. They're crazy and they're going to go broke, but we love them. Sorry.
Oh, the truth hurts, Tom.
No.
We know.
But we're rich. we're rich in culture, and we're rich in heritage and experience
and friends.
And friends. You know, like we have some of the best friends and community members I've ever met has been through motorcycling.
Absolutely.
And I'll say that time and time again. Like you, myself, going to work to pay the bills. I enjoy history and I love teaching, but some of the time I can't relate to again, who can relate to the idea of, oh, we're going out to the flat track this Saturday. We're going to take out a bike that I've spent all, summer on working on, or winter, and I'm going to go out there and rip it up, and hopefully I don't kill myself.
Right.
Like, who can relate to that other than our little branch of community? And that's, again, we're not rich, but the stories that we're going to hear and the stories we can pass on, it's worth more than money in my regard, in my aspect. And I think that's what, that's why we keep doing this.
That's
right?
great.
I personally have reached a point now. I'm going to be 53 years old. My 2 daughters are grown. The things that matter to me more now than money, are the experiences and meeting people and doing this, and come here to the coffee shop and pull shots all day and talk to people about their experiences on bikes and their rides. And that is so much more valuable. And I know it sounds cliche, but it's totally true. It means more now than it would have when I was 20, when I was thinking I wanted to make a ton of money, and rule the world. But it's different now. And I can understand where you're going, Tom, now with bikes.
Something else that you didn't ask this, but I'm going to make you blush, I think. You asked me a couple days ago about finding a pipe for one of your bikes, an exhaust system. I went home and I spent about an hour and a half going through my contacts and thinking, where did I see that or hear about that thing? Because I want to help this guy. I've had more enjoyment helping people than I've had doing things myself. That's got to be something like what you're talking about
Absolutely.
now.
Sure, as long as it goes the right direction. We don't send off a bike that we couldn't.
We don't want to talk about that bike anymore, Thaison.
But you know what I mean, like, yeah.
You want me to teach him to paint? Is that what this is about?
No. Oh, that's going to be another story.
Oh my God.
That's episode number 5.
That's right.
Right?
It is.
Steve's trying to run away from this episode.
YouTube episode number 5.
But we're going to get into it regardless.
The painting episode.
Yeah. So as we start to wrap this up, and I'll talk about this later on. Hopefully we have this guest on one day. But what are some of your favorite bike events that you've been to, that you've seen, and you're blown away that, you know, the bikes are out there and the culture's out there and they're racing, they're riding, they're doing all of it. What if you could tell someone you have to see this event or the show, what would you tell people to see?
Well, of course, these days, one of the biggest in the country is the Barber Vintage Week. It's huge in Birmingham, Alabama. It's a 10-ring circus. There's a huge museum there. It's one of the best in the world, in my opinion. The event is spectacularly beautiful. Other than killer hot weather or humid weather, it's got $1 million racetrack that holds GP automobile racing as well as motorcycle racing. They have dirt track there. They have trials there for that particular week. It's a fantastic event, and they have a huge swap meet that's growing. That's towards the general side of motorcycling that has something for everyone. Depending on your interest, because now the world is so specialized, another wonderful event are, well, I'll give you 2 examples. Antique Motorcycle Club of America, they have about 5, 6, 7 national events all over the U.S. every year. One of the biggest is Wauseon, Ohio, which is just outside of Detroit. It's so big you'll wear your feet out walking through that. But for particularly American bikes, parts, collectors, and they also have vintage racing that weekend. It's fabulous. And that's the AMCA's biggest meet of the year. Now, they used to have an event that's now independent that's almost that good for another reason. It's in Davenport, Iowa, and it's called the Chief Blackhawk Motorcycle Swap Meet. That's also annually. That's every Labor Day. It's a huge swap meet, and I took Maureen this year just so she could see an event that's about as big as the Albuquerque Fairgrounds, but just motorcycle parts. They have an oval dirt track there too, but it's a little bit downscaled from the Barber in terms of size and variety. Anyway, Davenport's to me a must-see. Other thing about that, and this is for your listeners, Davenport in Iowa is centrally located to a lot of outstanding other things. 60 miles to the north is the National Motorcycle Museum in Anamosa. About 80 miles to the west on the same weekend is a fabulous event for old farm tractor and engine and culture people that's called the Mount Pleasant Threshers Reunion. I took her to that this year just because of the variety of that. That's double the size of Davenport, so I couldn't even walk after these things. But talk about anything you're interested in these places. Those are wonderful events to see. So I could go on, but that'll give you a good start. And of course, if you're into California, there's so much great stuff there. Creativity in California, builders out there,
amazing,
fabulous stuff.
I know.
This is why I love having Tom around.
Again, encyclopedia.
It's amazing. I mean, it's just so much information.
I also, sorry to interrupt you again, but Maureen is sitting right next to us here at the table, and she also works for the museum. She works in the gift shop. She does like a lot of the buying and purchasing for that location. Albuquerque Museum, and every time I'm always bugging her whenever Tom and Maureen come in, and I'm always asking her what's the next exhibit.
Yeah.
Because I love museums. I'm just a museum kind of nut. But and every time I go to the museum, I always have to make sure I say hi to her if she's there. But you guys are kind of like a perfect match, right? No, honestly, like a match made in heaven. She loves museum and art, curating, and then you also kind of came together with your curating and motorcycle love and passion for art. And somehow, I mean, how did this relationship, how'd you guys meet? And it's like a match made in heaven, like I mentioned.
Well, thank you. That's another subject for another couple of books, but we met because we worked at the museum, and she worked the store and I worked in the back, and eventually we kind of intermingled because I was in the graphics department. Often she needed a sign for the store, and she'd come back and say, you guys help, and so that's how we started working together. But inevitably, I was sort of attracted to her for obvious reasons, and we started talking more about, let's go get a cup of coffee or something. And when we would go sit together, besides business of, oh my, here's another opening coming and blah, 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 we talked about the things we enjoyed. And there was a funny crossover. She was not a motorcyclist, nor does she ride now, but she cares about being outdoors and exploring in the same way that I do. And I said, I need to take you on a bike ride. Well, that opened that door up too. So one by one, we found more connections, and it put us together more.
For sure.
One other thing I want to say real quickly about museums, though, and motorcycles, which may not be so exciting, but they don't really mix really well in terms of the pure form. You've mentioned early on this business of motorcycles as art. The industry portrays it that way, and the culture wants to, but in my opinion, they're still two different things. And when I've had the luck, back when I was in the museum world, to have a bike in an exhibition, it was as an artifact or an object that had to do with a story. It wasn't a motorcycle for its own sake. But in a lot of cases, what the bike represented made everything to viewers who didn't care about bikes. And that is a hook for the future. Mm-hmm. If you've got a good story and it happens to have a motorcycle in it, there you really have something interesting, especially for people who have not so much interest in it.
I think maybe your vision for the way you see motorcycles is completely different from the way people have seen motorcycles throughout history.
Okay.
Right? And the way that a lot of people look at motorcycles, I don't think they can see it past the motor and the wheels and the tank, right? The way you do.
Okay.
And I think other people are starting to see it, like you mentioned, like Deos,
right.
And some of the magazines like Meta can start to see these things as works of art, but it's taken the industry a long time to get there.
Yeah.
You know?
Totally
I don't know
agree.
how to sum that up.
Well, it's taking something from function to more form, and that's what we're hoping for, right? It's always been function.
A mix, right?
And
a good mix.
Yeah. So, and that's where the art part of it comes down. It's the form.
Well, like a lot of your customers, we walk in here and she's instantly saying, you know what they should do? They should put this over here and build this here and put a bike up here on a stand, and that'll say motorcycle and blah, 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 blah. And why don't they do that? And why haven't they done that already? And so I think to myself, don't you dare say that to those guys.
Please, we need all the help we can get sometimes. No, I'm serious, because like I would love to have your perspective on
Sure.
You know, the way the business should look and function sometimes. I mean, we're not changing, obviously. We're not moving away from motorcycles as a coffee shop type of situation, but
I hope not.
We could always use an extra eye or two. Of course. Because we're in it so much.
Well, thanks, guys.
You're most welcome.
Thank you for coming out, Tom. It's always a pleasure. Maureen, thanks for sitting through this. We loved having you here as well, and always enjoy having you here at the shop. Go ahead and tell Thaison where you want to move things anytime you want.
Thanks, guys.
That was a great podcast, Steve. So honored to have him as a guest here today.
Yeah, Tom's just the coolest guy, right? I think one of the things I think we really appreciate about Tom is he's really humble. You know, he's got a great collection. He knows a lot. He's super smart, but he doesn't have to tell you that. You know, he just has this information, and if you want it, he's more than happy to share it with you. He actually, you know, took the time and just out of the kindness of his heart, spent a couple of days with me teaching me how to lace those wheels for the Aramaki. Gave me a lot of information about the Aramaki, and I enjoyed going down to his house and seeing his collection and talking to him every time I went down there. It was really awesome.
It's
man.
inspiring, right?
Yeah.
And I'm glad, we have these stories that we get to fall back on.
Yeah.
And, I want to open it up to a lot of other guys similar to Tom that have great collections and have wealth of knowledge like he does. Like, come into the shop, come talk to us, and we'd be happy to hear your stories and get you on the podcast or get you on the YouTube series.
Absolutely.
This is kind of what we created this shop for.
Exactly.
So come on down and visit us if you're as passionate about motorcycles as we are.
Awesome.
What do we have going on at the shop, Steve?
The shop is busy, man. We're busy. We're doing YouTube episodes. We're doing a web series. We do the podcast, and we've got a lot of cool merch here in the shop right now. We've got some new mugs that are kind of camping mugs that'll be perfect for this spring.
They're like the father version to the baby cappuccino mug that we got.
Yeah.
Our YouTube channel is actually, like we just mentioned last time on the last episode, it's starting to take off. And we just finished up episode 4, which was one of my favorite episodes. It was just kind of fun, and we're kind of resembled our personality here at the coffee shop a little bit more. You know, because again, like the first few episodes were a little bit on the seriousness tip, and we were kind of talking about the woes of the coffee shop and what it takes to run a business. Episode 4 is kind of like where we're feeling our groove, and we're kind of just having fun with it.
I think it's fun, man. I like it a lot. I'm a little excited about episode 5.
Sure.
There's a little drama.
There's a little
intrigue.
Just as fun for some people, not me.
We hit the road. We're on the road.
Yeah. No, episode 5 was fun too. That was a great event, us going down to El Paso and everything. And I think our viewers are going to like that, and they're going to like this episode just as much. But I feel like we're in our stride.
Yeah. I'd like to get some feedback. Wouldn't you like to hear some feedback on the episodes?
Maybe.
You just don't want to hear bad feedback, but I would like to hear some feedback. I like to hear what people have to say about the episodes.
Sure.
I think it'd be cool.
Yeah, and as they pick up steam, I guess we could say as they start to get moving more and getting more viewership and stuff. Just keep liking them, subscribing, as they say, like, follow, and subscribe, and we appreciate it because it lets us know that we're actually doing something right.
Absolutely.
For once.
Yeah.
So.
Cool. All right, Thaison. That was a good podcast tonight. I'll see you tomorrow at the shop.
You will.
For those of you that are interested in following us on social media, it's Rust is Gold Coffee, Rust is Gold Racing. We have a official website at rustisgoldcoffee.com. That's where our menu is in our online store, and you can check out all of our merch. We have a Patreon as well. If you feel so inclined to support our podcast, we would love for you to visit the Patreon. Donate what you can. It helps us keep the bills paid. And we would love to see you here at the coffee shop. We are here in Albuquerque. Stop in and order one of our specialty drinks. Meet one of our great staff. You can see them online as well at our YouTube channel. So ride safe, and we will see you on the next ride.
Not too far, an old-time rockabilly coffee bar. Wrecking machine tucked in the back. Elvis singing about a Cadillac. I'm on a BSA. Been riding all day. Leathers on, goggles too. Triumphant, I don't know what you wanna do. My baby's on a Vincent, has been for quite a while. She said it's rocking just her style. So let's ride, so let's ride, so let's ride, so let's ride. Come on, turn up, I got lumpy cams. American rocker as a matter of fact.